So, do you ever feel like an imposter? Do you ever feel like you don't quite know what you're doing and everybody's going to know? You know, this sort of thing often happens, right? That sort of thing can happen at work, right? If you get a new job where suddenly you're a manager and you aren't really sure that you know how to manage people, so you're loaded with self-doubt, but it's not just self-doubt. You're afraid people are going to know. You know, it can happen in lots of different aspects of life. It can actually happen when you're a first-time parent, a first-time parent, right? It's the first time you're a parent, you don't really know how to raise kids. You kind of have that, I don't know what to do with a human being that relies on me completely. And what if the kid figures that out? What am I going to do? There's actually a name for it. It's actually called imposter syndrome. It's actually identified by psychologists as a situation that arises where you start to doubt your own abilities. And by doubting your abilities, you actually start to feel like you're a fraud. And actually, it's very common with ministers, too. When you first step into it, you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I first step into it, I still don't know what I'm doing. Right? But I just show up, do the best I can. But the reality is that in any aspect of life, here's the thing about imposter syndrome, is that it doesn't just affect the thing you're worried about. It affects your whole life. Because if you feel like an imposter in any part of your life, you feel like an imposter in life. And sometimes that thing that we can't quite figure out is itself life. I'm not quite sure how I'm supposed to live my life. I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do. I'm not quite sure how to do really anything. And that can probably be one of the most limiting factors in our life, is this concept that can start to fill our mind with doubt, believing that we are somehow imposters in what we're doing. So, as we continue our series here against the odds, I want to talk about the really significance and the importance of you need to know who you are. You need to trust that you are someone who matters, that you are someone who does have a purpose. It can seem like there are times in our lives where it doesn't feel at all like we have a purpose. And a purposeless life can feel like an empty life. It can feel like a pointless life. And the thing that I want you to hear, if you hear nothing else I say for the rest of this half hour, is that you do have a purpose. That God created you with a purpose. You are uniquely qualified to do something that no one else will do the way you do it. But to find it, you kind of got to believe it. Now remember that in this series, what we're doing is that we're actually kind of looking at how do we deal with difficulties in our life? How do we deal with these situations where we got something going on in our lives? It feels like there's no way we can succeed. How do we go through that? Well, I would argue that in order to succeed at any great challenge, you got to have confidence that you were prepared for it, that you know who you are, and that you know that you can make a difference. Now, as we've gone through this series, what we're doing is we're actually walking through the book of Esther. Now, as I've mentioned, that Esther, I believe, is a fantastic model for how to deal with overwhelming difficulties in life. And as I've said, that Esther is one of my favorite books of the Old Testament, and I'm kind of excited because today is my favorite section of that book, when we see Esther kind of bring all the pieces together. But a key part of what she has to do is know who she is and believe that she's not where she is by accident. That she has to know that she is queen, and she has to know that she is here on purpose, with a purpose. Now, before we jump back in, let me catch us all up to make sure we're all on the same page. Just a quick review of the past 2 weeks. Now, remember that when we first met Esther, she was an orphan. Right? She was living as part of the nation of Israel, but that nation had been conquered. She's under rule by the Persians, one of the greatest empires of its time. Having lost both her parents, she's being raised by a cousin, a guy named Mordecai, who cares for her a great deal. And through some unlikely circumstances, rises up to become Queen of Persia. Now, Queen of Persia sounds like an impressive title, and it certainly is impressive in some ways. You certainly have privilege. You have influence. But what doesn't she have? She doesn't have authority, right? She's not the monarch. That's the king. But again, she does have influence and she has privilege. And we kind of see that a little bit early on because her cousin Mordecai gets a position as an official in the palace. So Mordecai is now an official. She's now queen. They can still interact with one another. When she first kind of started on this journey to be queen, she thought she might never see him again. So they have that relationship. But then last week we met another person, kind of our villain, so to speak. Right? Some guy named Haman. Remember that Haman was the highest ranking official in the court. Haman was the most powerful person in the kingdom except for the king himself. And he has some very distinctive aspects to his personality. He is quite full of himself. He is very arrogant. He is very self-entitled. He feels like people should bow down to him and respect him all the time, no matter what he does, even when he acts disrespectfully. And our friend Mordecai won't do that. Mordecai says, I'm not doing it. I'm not bowing down to you. And Haman takes that kind of personally. So he decides that he wants to kill Mordecai for not bowing down to him. But he decides that, well, that's not quite enough. That's not big enough. I should kill Mordecai and his entire race. I'll wipe them all out. I'll teach them a lesson. That's what happens when you don't honor me. And so the king wouldn't normally go for this, but Haman, being a very good politician, very good at manipulating people, comes up with this very deceptive story about there's this group of people in your kingdom that are really a threat to you. And because I honor you so much, king, I'm going to wipe those people out for you. And the king falls for it. And the king gives Haman permission to wipe out the entire nation of Israel. But it will be done some number of months in the future. So there's a little bit of time to deal with this. But as we were wrapping up last week, Esther learned of what was happening, and Esther came to a very challenging realization that she is the only one who can make a difference here. That as queen, she has access. She can try to speak to the king and to try to stop this. Now, before she started, she did something really, really important. It's the last thing we talked about last week. Do you remember what she did before she starts? She prays. Right? She starts out praying. But she also asks everyone that she trusts to pray. She asked Mordecai to pray for her. She asked Mordecai to ask everyone he trusts to pray for her. And so for 3 days, they're all praying and they're fasting. In other words, they're preparing themselves. And she's praying, I'm sure, for guidance, for courage, for a plan, to figure out what to do. But she's married to the king. Why does she have to pray before she goes and talks to the king? Well, because she plans to break protocol. She plans to go directly to the king to talk to him without being invited. And we're told that the punishment for that was death, because it was considered a threat to the king, that if someone actually walked into where the king was without being invited, they might be threatening him. So unless the king steps in and intercedes, automatically the guards capture you, haul you away. Now, is that an unreasonable fear for her? That the king would actually allow her to die? It's not unreasonable, because why did she become queen? Because the other queen broke the rules, and he got rid of her. So this king has demonstrated that he's willing to do that. So this is a pretty big deal. Right? This is a pretty scary situation. Now, to understand what Esther's going to do, we need to understand a little bit, just a little bit, about the way the palace complex is laid out. Because this would have been a very sizable structure, and it would have been broken into sections. And there's a section called the inner court. The inner court is where the king himself is. So that's where the rooms that the king stay in are located. That's where the king's throne is. And the rules are that no one enters the inner court unless the king invites them. And so the protocol is that if you want to see the king, you're supposed to go to what's called the outer court, which is another set of rooms outside of that where you wait. Someone lets the king know you're here. If the king decides he wants to see you, He will invite you in. But he's just as likely to decide he doesn't want to see you and never invite you in. And Esther decides she can't take that chance, that this is too important, that she can't follow the protocol of going to the outer court and hoping that the king invites her in. She realizes that she's got to be something much more direct than that. So the narrative tells us that on the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes, entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on the royal throne facing the entrance. Esther just broke protocol. She walked directly into the inner court. This would be considered almost an affront to the king, that you walked in here uninvited. Doesn't matter who you are. And the guards hold for just a second to see if they should grab her and take her away. And will this be the end of Esther? But Esther wants to make sure she has the best chance she can. So how does Esther pull this off? So, spoiler alert, she doesn't die, right? So how does she pull that off? Well, we see it in the text. What did she do? It says that she put on her royal robes. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes. What did she do? She actually, prior to entering the court, the inner court, said, you know what? I'm queen. I'm going to look like the queen. I'm going to put on those robes that only the queen wears. I'm going to put myself together. I'm going to walk in and look like the queen. What she had to realize, what she had to convince herself of, what she had to believe, was that she was no longer that little orphan girl who suddenly ended up in the palace somehow. She's now the queen. And the queen has responsibilities, but the queen also has rights. And she has influence. And she was aware of a dire situation, and she was going to handle it like the queen. She was going to look like the queen, she was going to walk in like the queen, and she was going to approach the king like she had a right to be there. And for her, I think this was way more than self-motivation. I mean, I do think she hopped herself up. She kind of I got to believe this. But also, I think she came to the realization that the privilege that she had found, the position that she had found, the opportunity that she had was not an accident. That this was God ordained. That she had actually been put here for a reason. That she was here to do something that no one else could do. That despite all the difficulties she had been through and how hard the road to this moment had been, God had not been neglecting her. God had moved her into position to make a difference like no one else can make a difference. She had to believe it about herself. She had to believe that God was with her. She realized that God had a plan for her life, and she was going to choose to step into that plan. Now, the questions that she had to answer about herself and her life are the questions I think that are before all of us. That all of us need to kind of think about those questions that Esther had to think about. I mean, the first question is, how do we see ourselves, right? Do we believe in ourselves? Do you believe in yourself? Do I believe in myself? Do I believe this is all just an accident, that I've kind of ended up wherever I am in this moment? And when I see someone in need or a chance to make a difference, that, oh, it's just an accident that happened? Or do you believe that you are a child of God, a loved child of God, with a purpose, who has value, and you have access, and you have influence? There are lives you can interact with in a way that no one else will. There are lives that you can impact and help and change and transform in a way that no one else will. So, do you believe that God loves you and God has given you a plan and a purpose for this life? My hope is that you do. But then the next question is, if we do believe that about ourselves, that God has created us on purpose, has positioned us on purpose, and in spite of the difficulties we've been through, we are now uniquely qualified to execute that purpose. If that's true, what are we going to do with it? I mean, do we believe that our position, our privilege, our resources, and our time are all just for our own benefit, to just be enjoyed ourselves? Or are all those things part of our purpose? Or all those things we're meant to use as part of our purpose? Or all those things that we're meant to leverage and take advantage of to influence and impact other people's lives, to help other people have a better life, a more whole life? Do you believe that God has a plan for your life? And do you want to step into it? Do I believe that God has a plan for my life? Am I willing to step into it? Those are questions that we all face. And that's the questions that Esther faced. And Esther decided that she had a call in her life, and she was going to step into that call in her life by stepping before the king, even though it was scary. Because she knew that her willingness to step into this moment could save thousands of lives, but it could also cost her hers. And that's another key thing to remember. Just because God has a plan for your life doesn't mean that plan's not scary or hard. Doesn't mean the road's not hard. It doesn't mean that we doubt things and we doubt ourselves. All those things are normal and all those things are okay. But if we can embrace God's love for us, trust that God has a plan for us, be willing to step into that, we get to see God do some pretty amazing things, and we get to be a part of it. So now what happens for Esther? What happens when she did that? It says that when the king saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. So basically, that's just protocol. The guards are looking at the king to say, if you don't want this person here, we'll get him out of here, but you need to let us know. So as he moves the scepter forward, that is granting her permission to approach. And then she thanks him. In other words, it's kind of weird for us, but she kind of reaches out and then thanks him for calling her forward. And what we see is that she believed that God was with her. She knew that she was queen here for this moment. And so she approaches the king as the queen approaches the king. Not some lost little girl who's wandering through the palace, but someone who was created for this moment to do what she was here to do. And because she acted like the queen, because she believed she was the queen, the king saw her as queen and treats her like the queen. Because the narrative tells us that the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." That's hyperbole, by the way. In other words, I'll give you anything you want, sort of thing. And Esther replied, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." So no, wait a minute. Right? She literally just risked her life to go to the king. She could have died. And what does she do? "Hey, you want to go to dinner? And not just you, let's bring Haman too." Now, what's she doing? She's exercising wisdom. If we've looked through the story over the past few weeks, what do we know about the king? The king is moody. The king is impulsive. Right? She's got one chance to convince the king to do something about this. And she's not going to leave it to luck, to hope he's in a good mood the day that she goes in there. Right? And this really shows us something that's really important, that, when we're dealing with difficult situations, we're like, well, I'm just going to leave it to God. No, rely on God, but do the best you can. Right? Use your abilities. God gave you everything you have, right? Your intellect, your insights, your ability, your wisdom, right? All those things are gifts from God. She wasn't going to trust that the king would happen to be in a good mood that day. She's decided that this is a difficult circumstance. I'm going to use all I've got. Now, she starts with God, right? She starts by praying. And she's trusting that God is with her. But then you know what she also did? She put together a plan. She thought about what it might go like, what might happen. She thought about what she should do along the way to give herself the best opportunity. And she thought about what specific actions she could take that would be prudent to maximize her chance for success. She's using everything she has. All those things are gifts from God. And it appears that her plan is working. Because the invitation gets the king's attention. This is not what he was waiting for, right? People ask the king for things all the time. So what is it that you want? And what she does instead, she invites him to dinner. So the king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet that Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. So, step one, the king and Haman join her for dinner. But what do they do now? Right? They sit down, they have some conversation, they have a little bit of wine. And finally the king asks her again, what is it that you really want? And it seems like this is her moment, right? You've got the king here, you've got Haman, horrible Haman here in the same room. This is where she jumps at it, right? This is her chance to blurt out exactly what she wants. What does she do? Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." What is she doing? Is she getting cold feet? Is she just kind of kicking the can down the road? Nah, she's got a plan. She's managing a very complex, very important situation. And there are two people involved with very different personalities. And so what she's doing is she is moving herself in position to maximize her success. As tempting as it is, and as tempting as it would be to just kind of plow through the moment, blurt out the problem, and hope it goes well, which is kind of how I like to do things, by the way. She doesn't do that. She uses finesse. And so she basically starts managing the personalities, for lack of a better term. Right? What's the king's life like? Right? People tell him yes all the time. People give him what he wants all the time. People ask him for things all the time. What she does is she starts building a little bit of healthy tension. One thing the king doesn't get very often is a hunt. So she extends the hunt a little bit. Remember, she walked in looking like the queen. And so she extends the hunt, stays on his mind. Give him a night to think about her. And send him on his way so when you see him tomorrow, he's been thinking about you all night long. So that's how she deals with the king. But now what about Haman? Remember, Haman is a very astute politician. He did not get to where he is at by accident. He has worked his way there. He has manipulated his way there. And so odds are that on this first dinner, Haman's kind of going to be on his guard a little bit. Because what she has done is very unusual. For the queen to invite the king and one of his senior staff to dinner. That's not normally what you do. So Haman would have been sitting there kind of wondering what's going on here. So if she were to blurt it out right now, he would have actually had his kind of political sense kind of really front of mind. And because he is so skilled, she could have said what was going on, and he could have quickly come up with spin and beaten her. So she doesn't do that. What she does instead, if that's his strength, she exploits his weakness. What's his weakness? Pride, arrogance, loves to be considered special. So basically what she does is, hey, king, come back for dinner tomorrow. And Haman, oh, you've been so delightful and so charming. Would you please join us again tomorrow? And it appears it's working, because the text tells us that. Then Haman went out that day joyful and pleased of heart. Yes, I am amazing. Right? I am so amazing. The queen is looking forward to spending time with me again. But his joy doesn't last very long, because the thing he wants more than anything is people to fear him. And if they don't respect him, be deathly afraid of him. That's what he wants most of all. And on his way out, floating up there, all excited about what has just happened, he walks by Mordecai. And when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and that Mordecai did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Now, how often do we do that? You've got this fantastic moment. Whether Haman was right or wrong, he just had a fantastic dinner, a fantastic social event. He's feeling really good about himself. And some guy doesn't bother to stand up. And now the whole day's ruined, right? Oh, what a jerk. And he gets all upset, and he's all worked up. In fact, he gets so worked up that he decides that I need to deal with this. And what happens next, although it won't seem like it, what happens next dramatically improves Esther's chance of success. Because Haman gets so angry at Mordecai that he goes home and has to figure out what he wants to do about it. Now remember, he already has permission to kill all the Jewish people a few months into the future, and that would include Mordecai. But he decides that Mordecai is so terrible that that just can't wait. That Mordecai's got to die tomorrow. So he goes home and he starts plotting how he can execute Mordecai. But he does have a problem. Remember that Mordecai is a palace official. So Haman cannot just go killing without the king's permission. So Mordecai takes the time, puts together a plan to kill, Haman takes the time, puts together a plan to kill Mordecai, and the following morning gets up bright and early, heads back to the palace to talk to the king. But of course, he's going to follow protocol, right? So when he goes to talk to the king, where does he go? He goes to the outer court, and he waits for the king to invite him in. Now, as Haman's put together this great plan that he has, and he's gone to talk to the king, something happened overnight that Haman has no idea about. Turns out that the king couldn't sleep. And when a king is bored, everybody rushes around the king to make the king not be bored. And so when the king can't sleep, he says, hey, I'm bored. What can I do? And so he decides that what I should do is read about how awesome I am as king. Because for the kingdom, there are these logbooks kept of all the things that go on. And so what happens is the king's there reading through the logbooks. And he reads about the point where Mordecai had saved his life. Remember last week we talked about that Mordecai had overheard a plot to kill the king, got information to the king, and the king's life was saved. And so as the king reads this, he says, hey, Mordecai helped save my life. How was he rewarded for that? And he discovers that Mordecai was never rewarded. And so just as the king realizes that Mordecai has never been rewarded, he hears, oh, hey, Haman, one of your highest officials is out in the outer court. So the king says, oh, great, send him in. Now, what is Haman ready to do? He is ready to ask for Mordecai's execution. But of course, you don't speak until the king speaks to you, right? So the text tells us that. So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Now, we know that Haman is a hugely arrogant person, so what does he do? He says, Haman thought to himself, well, who would the king want to honor more than me? So for Haman, this is a dream come true. Oh man, the king wants to honor me. So basically, Haman pulls out his wish list. And what does Haman like to do? He likes to be the center of attention. He likes people to fear him. He likes to feel bigger and more important than people. So what he says is, oh, if you want to honor someone, what you should do is take one of your royal robes, those robes that only you wear, and then put that on that person. And then take the royal seal that only you wear on your head and put that on that person. And then take one of your best horses that only you ride and put that person in their robes and the seal on the horse. What is he doing? He describes what it looks like to be king. In other words, Haman's biggest wish is to look like you're the king. And then Haman adds to that and says, after all that's done, take one of your highest officials, lead the horse through the streets of the city with this person on the back, calling out, this is what is done for those who the king wishes to honor. Now Haman's psyched because this is his moment, right? Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse. Do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the gate. Leave out nothing you have suggested. This is like the worst punishment that could possibly happen for Haman. Because Haman came here to destroy Mordecai. And now Haman has to give Mordecai the honor he most wanted for himself. And the king says you have to do it. You have to do it, because we know how the king deals with people who don't do what he asks. So Haman goes and gets the royal robe and has to personally put it on Mordecai and take the royal seal and personally put it on Mordecai's head. Even helps Mordecai onto the horse. And then Haman has to walk through the city streets, repeating over and over and over again, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. This is how Haman spends his day. And then when it's done, afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate. Otherwise, Mordecai just went back to work, right? But Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. And this little encounter between the king, Haman, and Mordecai, I think demonstrates another key part of dealing with really difficult circumstances. Do all that you can and trust that God will do what you can't. Look how this came together, right? Esther put together a great plan, and she's been executing that plan, right? She's done the work to endear herself towards the king, to have the king thinking about her for the next day. She's gotten Haman pumped up with his pride and his arrogance, and she's kind of avoided the initial fight with him when he would have been ready for it. And then God steps in, right? There's no way that Esther could have known that the Haman and Mordecai would have had that encounter, that Haman would have wanted to kill Mordecai. She couldn't have known that the king would not be able to sleep. She couldn't have known that the king would have happened to have read about when Mordecai saved his life. She could not have known that the king would order Haman to honor Mordecai. She did what she could do, and God stepped in to do what she couldn't. When we're doing hard things, overwhelming things, we will rarely have all the answers. We go as far as we can, and things start to come together. Again, you put together a real plan. You put together a good plan. You put together the best plan that you can. But trust that God will fill the gaps. Do what you can. Trust that God will do what you can't. You go as far as you can see, and when you get there, you will be able to see further. And so after all of this, Mordecai is just back at work. But Haman goes home. He is dejected. He is humiliated. He is about as far off of his game as he could possibly be. And when he's at the lowest moment he can be, the king's men show up. Time for dinner. Let's go back to that dinner. And you can't delay it. So now, in that condition, Haman goes to the dinner. And again, Haman, the king, and Esther sit down to dinner, have a little wine. The king asks Esther, what is her request? And now she delays no longer. Now she tells the king that there are people who might die, that the lives of her people and her life is in danger, and she asks the king to spare it. She says, for my people have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. And again, what we see Esther doing here is executing this well thought out plan, right? She's taking care of the personality. She's gotten them in the right mood. She's put together a good plan, but what else did she do? She also thought about what she was going to say. She didn't just plan her actions, she planned her words. Because the way she speaks about things, right? My people and I have been sold to those who would kill us. If she just said her people, depending on the mood, the king might go, well, you're fine, don't worry about it. She made it personal. And she made it personal in such a way that the king would see this as an attack on his family. And an attack on the king's family is an attack on the king himself. So she has positioned this perfectly, right? This personal approach that she has taken by choosing her words so carefully makes it feel like there is a perpetrator attacking the king himself by attacking his queen. Who would do such a thing? The king demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Now, how do you think Haman's feeling about now? Because remember, Haman didn't know her nationality. Haman had no idea this affected her. He didn't know she was related to Mordecai. Because remember, what was the advice that Mordecai gave her before she went to the palace? Tell no one where you're from. So in this moment, Haman is just realizing that this affects her, and now the king knows. I'm thinking he's feeling pretty sick about this time. And with everything coming together as it has, Haman never even responds. Esther replied, "The wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and the queen. So she has worked, you think she's been working for 5 days, 4 to 5 days at this point, right? 3 days of preparation, the first day of the dinner, now in the second day, finally when everything was ready, she makes her accusation. And as she does it, the king is enraged. In fact, the king is so angry, he jumps up and walks out of the room. And Haman knows what this means for him. Haman knows that unless something happens, he will be killed. So he decides the thing to do is to beg Esther for his life. And so what he does is he actually kind of leaps on the couch where she is to beg her to spare him. It says, in despair, Haman fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. So his attempt to save himself makes it look even worse, right? It basically accelerates his doom. Right? The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. And that's the end of Haman. Now, this one little section of Esther's story, this one piece we've looked at today, I think it gives us kind of the most complete picture of how do we deal with our lives when the circumstances we're in are so difficult. What are the steps that we follow? Right? Because I don't want to kind of say it's a bland formula, but it is a pattern to follow. That when we follow it, we seem to be able to overcome things we don't believe we can. Right? Where did she start? Where she started with prayer. Started with prayer in her own life, and she asked for the support of those around her. So she talked to God. I think she talked to God about what she was worried about, what she wanted to do, asked God for courage, asked God to help her build a plan, show her where to go forward, what steps should she take. So she starts by talking to God. But then she also knows who she is, right? She knows she is a loved child of God. But also, she knows that this moment that she is in is not an accident. Again, the road for her was incredibly hard to reach this moment. Well, guess what? The road for you has been incredibly hard to reach this moment. But all those things have come together to make you who you are, to give you the abilities, the insights, the thought process that you have. So know that you are where you are on purpose, with a chance to make a difference. Believe it, know it, just as she did. Trust that you were meant for the role that you're in. And if you're undertaking a godly cause, trust that God is in it with you. God doesn't send you out alone. He's in it with you. But don't just rest on that. He gave you everything you have. Right? Your intelligence, your intellect, your wisdom, right? Those things are gifts from God as well. Use those. Plan ahead. Put together a plan. Right? Our opportunities, our resources, right? All of those things are things we can use to be more successful. Lean heavily on God and work as hard as you can. And when we do that, if you do what you can, God will do what you can't and bring the pieces together. When we're dealing with the most difficult situations, and I know some of you are dealing with some incredibly difficult situations, this is the path and plan we follow, knowing it doesn't always go as we hoped, but the pieces come together. We've seen Esther apply these steps so effectively. Right? Her and Mordecai now have gotten rid of Haman. Haman's gone. So they're all set. Right? Haman's gone. The queen is safe. Mordecai's safe. The people are all safe, right? All the people of her nation are safe, right? Well, when she asked the king, okay, this is what happened. I've explained to you what happened. Would you please stop that decree that's going to have my people killed? Would you please put a stop to that? When she asked the question, the king tells her, remember, what has already been written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring can never be revoked. So in spite of all that, she has gotten rid of Haman. But the order to have her people killed is still in effect. What's she going to do? We'll see that next week.